Hello there. Looks like we got some people filing in the rooms here now. I just wanted to welcome everybody, and this is another training session in the MCNC CNE Summer Webinar Series. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Cisco ASA Anyconnect VPN and integrating that with Active Directory for an authentication source. My name is Christopher Rose. I'm a senior client network engineer here, and I've got my email information up on the screen in case any of you have any questions. Basically, you can email me or you can give me a call here. We also have a link here to the webinar information. The slide deck from this presentation will be available after the presentation, as well as some other documents that I'll mention throughout the presentation. So let's go ahead and move on to the agenda here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to review kind of the security implications of remote access. Obviously, this is a big topic in the news recently with a lot of the security breaches and that kind of thing. So, it's kind of a hot topic right now. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about how remote access VPN fits into your overall organization IT strategy. If you don't have an overall security strategy, you probably ought to look into doing that. And we'll talk a little bit about how your remote access fits into that. The next thing we're going to do is review what the Cisco AnyConnect SSL Remote Access VPN is and kind of what it can do for you. Talk a little bit about the feature set, the benefits, that type of thing. The next thing we're going to do is we're kind of going to explore the benefits of using authentication servers instead of local accounts on the ASA for remote access. And then we're going to do some short demos using the ASDM, or basically the GUI configuration component of the ASA, to convert an existing Anyconnect SSL VPN configured for local authentication to AD integrated authentication with some DAP policy access controls. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the security implications of remote access. Obviously, the biggest piece of news in this regard was the Target Store hack, and kind of as I say here, it's a prime example of why you should care about remote access security and proper firewall zoning of your information assets. I don't know how many of you read the news articles about this, but essentially what had happened was a Target store had allowed an HVAC vendor remote access to a billing system inside of the Target store, and through that remote access, once the hackers had been able to basically log in using the AC company's credentials, they were also able to get into some PCI type systems that handle credit card transactions that weren't properly zoned. And basically we all know the rest of the story. So why is this important to you? So I'm gonna tell you just a little bit about kind of some of the things I've seen as far as remote access security issues, especially for applications during network assessments that I've performed for LEAs. Obviously, I won't be mentioning any names here. I have come across situations. The biggest one is exposing, sensitive information or applications directly off your firewall. I have seen this many times, and I can understand some of the reasons behind why it happens, but it's not really a good practice. In one example, I was able to, with one school district, I was able to actually get into their security cameras and, basically look around in the schools and control the security cameras. They were directly exposed off the firewall with very poor password username protection. Another one I see a lot is folks that will statically NAT internal desktop machines to external addresses on the firewall and allow RDP access in order to give people, remote remote desktop capabilities to work on their work machines from home. I've managed to get into, finance director's desktop, AD administration servers, DNS, DHCP, that kind of thing. A lot of that comes from, poor password policy. The other thing I have seen too, sometimes I've seen wireless administration systems basically hung off the outside of the firewall so people could get to those, for ease of administration. And, sometimes the username and passwords aren't very good on those either. So when we talk about exposing applications directly off your firewall, why is that such a bad idea? Well, essentially because you're exposing yourself to brute force or dictionary type infiltration attacks. So when you do that kind of thing, you really have to ask yourself, basically, how good is your password policy? And then when was the last time you checked the audit log on any of these applications to see who was kind of knocking on your door as far as trying to get in? And do you actually have an IPS or an SIEM, some type of security event correlation that's actually monitoring that and alerting you to the type of people, or who are trying to get into your systems? If you're like a large number of LEAs or education organizations, you probably don't have an IPS or an IDS, and if you're like a lot of network folks, you're really busy and you wind up not checking those audit logs. And then we also know sometimes because users complain, we don't always have the best password policies. So we did a little experiment here with our ASA here in the lab here in the in the CNE lab. Basically, we set up a Cisco AnyConnect VPN on this, and we sat back and we logged who was trying to hack into it over about, it was less than a week. We had pretty close to, 2,700 attempts to hack into the, the ASA, and some of them were on some pretty non-standard ports. And then we kind of compiled a list of the number of attempts made under which usernames. Obviously, you can see here that there's a lot of folks looking for root access, admin access, that kind of thing. You can also see that we were subjected to almost persistent and constant dictionary type attacks where basically someone's just banging on the root password, trying to eventually guess that. And then, of course, our most persistent hacker, I guess we probably should send him some kind of award or something, was this guy here from the Ukraine, Eastern Europe. It's, again, not a surprise as far as, what we see as far as, where a lot of the hacking attempts come from. So how does an SSL VPN fit into your overall security strategy? So we've talked here a little bit about some of the issues as far as remote access to some of these applications. So let's talk a little bit about how an SSL VPN can help you out with some of these issues. So why would you want to configure an SSL VPN? It's usually to allow access to internal assets without exposing them publicly on the outside of your firewall, because this is part of a good firewall zoning and security policy. Typically with firewall zoning policies, what you want to do is you want to try to separate your servers, your internal users, your external users, and then sometimes even, you construct different zones for different, levels of data as far as this level of sensitivity or criticality, and you do that to control access, basically. Now, one of the, again, we'll just mention it again here, the advantages of an SSL VPN is that you're not exposing those internal assets to the internet at large for brute force attacks, or in some cases, denial of service. If you've got your cameras or something else exposed on the outside of your firewall for remote access, in addition to people trying to break into it, another thing you're doing is you're exposing it for denial of service. Now, one of the disadvantages of an SSL VPN is, some of your public-facing assets, applications that people are logging into, especially ones that have a large number of users, like, Timekeeper, things like that. A lot of them already have web interfaces that are constructed using SSL and, are already fairly secure, and in a lot of cases, it doesn't make sense to have folks, have to log into a remote access VPN in order to get to that application and use it. Obviously, the call on this is going to be, on your end as far as how secure you feel like those applications are and whether, it's okay to go ahead and expose them or not. But, an example of some of those types of applications that have pretty good security, are things like the Timekeeper web interface or, something like a Citrix server, basically. So typically when, what I find is, as far as SSL VPN in an LEA environment, what it's best used for is typically, remote access for basically your network admin staff. It's also good for locally hosted applications used by a small number of internal users, and what we find in a lot of cases is these applications also have very sensitive data. They're things like finance, payroll, student records, that kind of thing. The other thing it's good for is when, the finance director or whoever basically comes in and wants RDP access to his internal desktop, or if you have some other user that wants that. Obviously, rather than hanging it on the outside of your firewall and giving someone basically a clear path to hack into your internal network, by putting this out there, and through a VPN, you can kind of secure that. Access by vendors. Basically, your folks that want to monitor your HVAC, other types of industrial monitoring, or even folks who are providing your application support. If you have application servers, sometimes folks will want remote access to those. And last but not least, access to, by your local police department to monitor your security cameras. I see that one a lot too. By putting it behind a VPN, you can ensure basically that you're not allowing the rest of the world to try to get into that. So we'll talk now a little bit about, so putting this all together, basically how do you protect remote access that you offer against dictionary and hacking attacks? Basically, it's like we've said here many times, don't expose sensitive systems directly off of the firewall unless absolutely necessary. It's like I said, those few secure apps, where it makes sense, it's probably okay. But for the most part, you want to try to use a VPN if you can. Go ahead and look into acquiring, if you don't already have, some type of IPS or security events correlation system. I think these will become I guess a hotter item with folks as time goes on, especially now that, because these can also help you with DDoS and remediating that type of threat. And because the DDoS stuff seems to be taking off here recently, I think that's going to be, we're going to see that as an increasing trend as far as, folks looking for those types of systems. Obviously, the gold standard as far as security for remote access is using two-factor authentication, and that's one thing that the ASA can actually integrate. It's a separate solution, obviously, that you have to buy, whether it's VeriSign tokens or there's several other different vendors that make various types of solutions for that. Now, we also realize that, folks have limited budgets, limited time, those kinds of things. So obviously, if neither, getting IPS, or getting two-factor authentication is available, one of the things that you can do now to, improve this is just improve your password policy, by adding some password complexity and requiring people to rotate passwords. I mean, we all know that the users are going to complain when you ask them to do that, but, if you can explain to them why, it's a good idea to do that, then in most cases, they'll usually go along with that. All right, so now that we've covered kind of how, remote access kind of fits into your security strategy, let's talk a little bit about the Cisco AnyConnect SSL VPN and what it can do for you. So the Cisco AnyConnect SSL VPN is basically a remote access VPN from Cisco that uses port 443 only to make secure VPN connections. It used to be that the older Cisco IPsec client needed additional ports open for IKE and ES type packets. With the SSL VPN, as long as you have a port 443 open, you're ready to go. The Anyconnect clients are available for almost any device you can think of and many different operating systems. They have clients now for Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS. They even have them for Kindles now, certain Kindle systems. The client installation process is very simple. One thing I will throw in here is some of the Cisco, terminology can be a little bit confusing sometimes, in the sense that in the Cisco world, they'll refer to an SSL VPN as a clientless VPN, and that is actually something a little bit different than the actual Anyconnect SSL VPN. The actual Anyconnect SSL VPN actually does have a client basically that is installed on your machine. The key is just to make sure that you understand, that when we talk about the Anyconnect client SSL VPN, what we're actually talking about is the client version. You have to get a special license in order to use the clientless version, and it's also a lot more complicated to configure. But the client installs very easily, from a web page or from an application store if you're using an Android or an iOS device. It's also a whole lot easier to administer. Your user profiles can be controlled from the ASA, and usually you only have to give the end user a URL link to get them to the firewall, and once they get there, it will automatically, if they don't have the client installed, will automatically install it and configure it for them. Client also supports some enhanced security features like IKE version 2 for security. It also provides DTLS functionality in case you're running VoIP across an encrypted remote access connection. It also provides advanced feature support for things like Active Directory integration or Kerberos authentication. It also has a very good client-side logging for debugging purposes, so if you've ever had to set up a remote access system, we all know sometimes that getting it to actually work the first time can be pretty difficult. Having that client-side logging is a very good thing to have. The other thing is it will also integrate with many two-factor authentication solutions, in the sense that Cisco pretty much provides support for almost all of the two-factor authentication solutions that are out there, in that they provide a back end that most of them will integrate with. So why should we use Active Directory, or for that matter any other type of authentication server for VPN authentication, whether that's Radius or whether that is AD or Kerberos? It's mostly because local accounts databases have issues. If you're like the vast bulk of folks who have the ITS ASA set up at your site, for the most part, if you have VPN configured, it's probably using a local accounts database there. I kind of like to call them, local accounts databases roach motels, because they, it's like the old saying, they go in but they don't come out. A lot of times usernames and passwords get put in these systems, but because they live off somewhere separate from your main directory service, people forget about them. And as employees come and go, you'll have old accounts in there. The other thing is, in most cases, these local account databases are not configured with any kind of complex password complexity or change policies. Usually you're not auditing them or logging them, so you have no idea who's sitting there banging on them and whether they're even getting in or not. The other thing is, with the Cisco AnyConnect VPN client, you can't actually initiate a password change from the client. So if you are using a local accounts database on your ASA for remote access, then you can't initiate a password change from there. That's something you actually have to log into the firewall and change manually. Now, some special some special things to think about if you're using the local accounts database on your ASA. If you have an ITS managed ASA firewall, is that it presents a whole nother set of additional problems. Specifically, it involves around managing access, specifically because you're not controlling the configuration on that ASA, and because the accounts are local there. Anytime you want to change a password on an account, you have to put in a ticket. Anytime you want to delete a user account, say somebody leaves the organization, you have to put in a ticket. Anytime you want to change someone's access policy as far as what they can get to or what they can't, you have to put in a ticket. If you want to get, your auditing configured or to be able to get your remote access auditing logs, it's another ticket. So how do we remedy some of these issues? Basically, using Active Directory, what kind of benefits can we get that are going to help remediate some of these issues? Well, one of the things you get is all your remote access user accounts and permissions can be admin from your local AD server, including password resets, which means you don't have to put tickets in the ITS to do that. Your AD logs will show, remote access logins and attempts, so you can keep an eye on those. The only tickets that are required to ITS are basically to configure, get this set up initially, and then if you need to add security groupings, for DAP policy mappings, those are really the, basically if you need to provide a different level of security access, that, you would need to work with ITS to get that set up on the firewall. But once you do that, it's just a matter of dropping people into groups in your Active Directory to give them those permissions. The other thing is, password change and complexity policy can be the same as your AD domain policy. Obviously this cuts down on confusion. It means if you have implemented a password change or complexity policy on your AD servers, like password rotation or whatever, it will happen through the VPN client. The VPN client, when you've integrated authentication, will actually pass those forced password change requests through and allow the user to actually change their password, with the VPN client, so they don't get locked out. The other benefit, which I think is the most important, is your users are happy, and part of the reason is because they don't have a separate username and password for their remote access login. They can basically just use their network password and login. So in a way, it's kind of like a single sign-on solution too. So what do we have to do basically to get ourselves set up to do this? Essentially on the AD side, what you're going to want to do to prepare, it's actually fairly simple. You're going to need to create a bind account that the ASA can use to query the Active Directory. And essentially all that account needs to be is just a standard user account. It doesn't have to have permissions to anything else on your, in your directory. Basically all the ASA is going to do is basically use that account to log into AD and query usernames and passwords as far as, for authentication. It doesn't actually retrieve any passwords or anything like that, so it is secure. If you're going to use secure LDAP to go, between the ASA and the AD server, which I would recommend that you do, standard LDAP will pass usernames and passwords back and forth in unencrypted format, but you'll need to make sure your Microsoft Certificate Services is set up. For the most part, if you have a Microsoft domain, I know a lot of folks have already configured this for various other features in Microsoft Windows servers and desktop workstations that would require cert services to be configured. I know a lot of folks already have those set up. The last thing you're going to need to do is basically just create some groups in your AD, to cover the different types of network permissions that you're going to require as far as for remote access. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, actually I've gone in and basically I've created some of these things in a test AD domain we have here in the lab, and I'm just going to kind of show you how those are set up. so that you can just kind of see it visually yourself. Like I said, I already set it up ahead of time just to kind of save some time here. So I'm going to pull up here. Hopefully, I've got to move this over to my other screen. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and log in here to this. So here you can see I have an AD. This is just your typical Windows AD administration tool here. Basically what I did, the first thing I did was I created a bind account for the ASA. And as you can see, I appropriately named this account ASA. Basically just standard permissions. I didn't do anything special with this. The one thing I did change on here is that and I'll see if I can find it here. I set this account so that the user can't change the password and so that the password never expires. And the reason you want to do that is because if you have a password expiration policy on this, because the username and password to query this account is hard-coded in your ASA, anytime this password changes, you're going to have to update the configuration in your ASA. So when you create this account, I actively encourage you to make this a very long, very complex password, because once you put it in here, you're not going to have to worry about it. But you know, obviously for security reasons, you want it to be very good because it's not going to change. Now, I also went ahead and created a couple of user accounts in here. I created one for a theoretical, I'm going to flip back here, for a guy named Tom, who's basically our network admin who needs remote access. And then I created one for Bob, who's an HVAC systems manager for the company we contract with for our HVAC systems. So you go up here and basically I created Bob, and I aptly named him Bob Woodward because we all love Watergate. And then I also have Tom down here, who I named Tom Jones because, you know, we all like the singer. So those guys are in there. Now, the next thing I did was I created the groups for our VPN permissions. Usually what I recommend is that you give some kind of standardized pre-formatting to the group name so that you can easily find them all in one place. In this case, I put, VPN basically in front of the group names. So in this case, I created an a VPN HVAC admin group. And as a member, basically I put our Bob Woodward, our HVAC admin in here. And then I created another one basically for our network admins, our VPN network admins. And I put our Tom Jones in here since he's going to be our network admin. And that's pretty much all you have to do. There is one other piece of information usually that you'll need from your Active Directory, and that's your base DN, because that's what's going to tell the ASA where to actually query the user accounts. Typically, it's usually just your domain name, and I'll show you that here in just a sec. So before we move on to configuring the authentication server on the ASA, let's talk a little bit here about DAP policies. Basically, DAP policies are short for dynamic access policies. Cisco has come up with these dynamic access policies as a way to kind of replace the old kind of hierarchy of permissions and attributes and things in VPN configuration. The idea was to try to make things a little more simple than the way they used to be with Radius. So all these DAP policies are basically, it's almost kind of like an ACL. So let's talk a little bit here. You know, each DAP policy is going to have a priority number attached to it. And the thing to remember about these are that the higher the number is, the higher the priority the policy is going to be. So essentially 25 is going to be considered, if a policy has a priority of 25, it's going to be considered a higher priority than a policy that has a priority number of 1. The DAP policy, when you go into the configuration in the ASDM, has 2 main items that we're really concerned with. One of them is an action, and that's very simple. Basically, all the action is whether a person's going to be allowed to connect or whether we're going to terminate them. And then the other thing that we'll be concerned with are our network ACL filters, which are basically just access lists. There are some additional things that can be configured in there, but for the most part, these are only for folks that are using the NAC piece of the Cisco VPN client, which most folks aren't using. So, and it's a whole nother topic that, you know, we're not, basically we wouldn't have the time to get into here. So when you set up these policies, it's kind of like a router ACL in the sense that, you know, things are prioritized, there's permits and denies and that type of thing, but the thing to remember is that, you know, these policies are all going to get merged together to form kind of a cohesive policy. So when you configure your DAP group policy, there is a default DAP group policy that gets applied if nobody is a member of, you know, basically any groups that would make another DAP policy apply to them. So usually you set your default DAP policy to basically just terminate the connection. Basically the reason we do that is if, you know, somebody isn't in a VPN access group, well, we want to terminate them. Once I show you the DAP policy configuration area, a lot of this stuff will become more clear, so just bear with me. Now, when we talk about network ACLs for DAP policy, they're just a little bit counterintuitive, and this is usually the thing that trips most people up when they set this up initially. When you're attaching network ACLs to a DAP policy for a group of users, basically, the ASA will only allow an access list to be attached that has either all permit statements or all deny statements. And, you know, that confuses folks, and I can understand that, but it makes sense if you understand in totality how basically the resultant DAP policy is kind of put together from the other DAP policies. If you can list multiple ACLs in a single DAP policy, but the thing to remember is that the ASA won't process them in order, but basically what it does is it merges them together into one big list, and it will then it will put the blacklist or the deny entries at the top, and then it will process the permits after that. Now, if a user tests conditionally positive for more than one DAP policy, then the higher priority DAP rules get precedence. And just as kind of an exercise here, I put basically how these ACLs are going to get processed by the ASA from these DAP policies. Each DAP rule has its network ACLs retrieved, so if you have one or more ACLs in a DAP policy, the first thing the ASA is going to do is it's going to get those access lists. Then what it's going to do is merge them all together. The ACLs are going to be merged in order by DAP priority first. In other words, you know, the higher the number of the DAP policy, those rules are going to go first. And then if ACLs have the same DAP priority, then ACLs with blacklists come first, whitelists next. Again, I know this will sound very confusing to folks, but it's one of those, once you get in and you actually configure it and you work with it a little bit, it starts to make sense. So for an example here, to create an HVAC policy, we're going to actually create 2 DAP rules. The first is attached to an ACL to permit access to just the HVAC server. Basically, it's a permit to the IP of the HVAC server. Then the second policy we're going to implement is basically a deny any ACL, which is applied to implement the default deny policy. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the priority on the permit DAP rule to a higher priority number so that it gets processed first. And by setting the second policy to a priority number less, we're going to make sure it gets processed last. So now we're going to do a little bit of a demonstration here on the ASA, showing basically how we add a local, an AD server to the ASA, make sure it will connect to that, and use that bind account to log in and actually test and make sure that you're able to authenticate. And then I'm going to show you how I created some DAP policies here to implement the kind of access that we were talking about, basically allowing our HVAC guy only to his HVAC server, allowing our network admin to anywhere he wants to go on the network, and then terminating anyone else who tries to get in. One other thing I wanted to point out was, that the ASDM provides a test mechanism where you can input all of your LDAP conditions, and it will show you the result DAP policy. And we'll go ahead and do these demos here now. So let me get my ASDM over on the right screen here. So where you're going to find this stuff is when you log into the ASDM. If you go under configuration and you go to the remote access VPN section down here, when you're looking to initially set up your LDAP server, the place you're going to go is this thing here that says AAA and local users. In the Cisco world, any type of external authentication server is referred to as an AAA. Basically, in their world, that stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting, because they expect those servers to be able to do all of those things. So what you're going to do here is you're going to go in here under your AAA server groups, because when you set up an authentication server, whether it's the local accounts database, an AD server, a Windows domain, whatever, it's going to be put into a server group. And essentially the point of these groups is to basically allow you to go in and configure multiple servers so that you have redundancy, and so that you also can put in more than one authentication mechanism. So like if all your LDAP goes online, you can fall back to your local accounts or what have you. So we're going to go here under LDAP, and you're going to see down here, servers in the selected group. You'll see this LDAP server that I configured. Now you can see the configuration here was pretty simple. I basically just had to tell the ASA which interface the server was located off of. I just put in the DNS name here because we have it configured in our DNS server, so I can do the name lookup. This timeout is basically how long it's going to wait to basically fail this server, as far as it, if it can't get an authentication from it. The rest of these parameters are pretty self-explanatory. Basically, in this case, I didn't enable the SSL just because I put this together quickly for this presentation. So we're on the standard LDAP port. I set the server type to Microsoft. It also supports Novell, OpenLDAP, Sun directory servers. And then this base DN here is the other piece of information I was mentioning that you're going to need as far as configuring really any other application that will query your AD. Typically, it's basically just this DC equals, your domain name, and then your, the appendix to that, the .org part. So you got DC equals CNE 2012, comma, DC equals org. If you ever run into trouble figuring out what that is, obviously we can help you with that. They also, Softera makes an LDAP browser that can help with that as well. You can also set the query of the scope, as far as how deep this thing wants to look down for group memberships and things like that. Typically, I just leave it at all levels beneath the base DN. Then we have to put in our login DN account or our bind account. So, you know, it's a member of the CNE 2012 domain, and then ASA was the account. I put the login password here. So once we have all of that in here, we'll click OK. And now, once you've got all that information in, if you want to actually test to see if it actually works, you just click on this little button over here that says Test. And it looks like I've got some changes apparently that didn't get applied, but no changes were made. That was interesting. Okay, so once you hit test, you're going to get this box here. You're going to say, okay, I want to test my authentication. And in this case, we're going to test Bob's, using Bob's login. So we'll say, hey, I'm Bob, and Bob's password is Bob, 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 which sounds like an old 50s song. Once we put that in there, then we're going to hit OK. And it looks like it wants my firewall admin password here, so we'll go ahead and put that in too. Oops, if I type it correctly. There we go. And here we can see that the authentication test to host CNE AD1 2012 is successful. So now we know that our authentication service is working. Now, once we know that, in order to actually turn on the authentication for the VPN configuration, we actually have to go up here under our Anyconnect connection profile. And usually you'll see a couple of, or sometimes 3 or 4 of these different tunnel groups basically. And if you see this part here where it says authentication method AAA LDAP, basically when you go in to configure this, all you have to do, in a lot of cases it will have been set to local. All you got to do is just change this to LDAP and then hit OK. And then obviously apply your changes and save them. So we've got our authentication server integrated now. Now, how do we configure these policies to control where these folks are going to go? To do that, we're going to use this section here that says Dynamic Access Policies. And you can see here that I've already created some dynamic access policies that kind of fit in with what we're looking to do. Now, when you look at your DAP rule set, there's always going to be a default access policy. And this is the one I was telling you that we're going to want to set to terminate. So essentially all I did with this policy was I just went in here and I basically changed this action here to terminate. And then here you can see all of these other configuration things that we're talking about. And like I said, the ones that we're going to be mainly concerned with are this action of continue or terminate, and then this network ACL filters here. So now that we have it configured so that it will allow folks to authenticate using their AD credentials, and we have a default policy that says basically we're only going to allow our we're not going to allow anyone in unless they fit in these groups. So now we have to create these rules above here that basically create these policies in these groups. So what I did was, the first one I set up was for a network admin, and I made his ACL priority pretty high there. So what you're going to do is when you create your policy, basically the first thing you want to do is say, okay, what AD group do I want this policy to apply to? And basically you're going to come in here and you're going to go in here and you're going to say add, except I'm going to do edit because I already have this configured here. And then you'll get this box here where basically it'll say an attribute member of, and then this will usually be blank. You can get it to actually list the AD groups by actually just clicking this button here, get AD groups. And then as you can see, it will actually bring you a list of all the groups that are configured in AD, and then you just pick the one that you want. In this case, I said our network admins are going to be the folks that this rule applies to. So we're going to hit OK. Oops, should have done that. There we go. And then I set the action to continue because we want them to be able to log in. And then for network ACLs and filters, I set none. And the reason why is because we want to allow our network administrator to get to everything. So now, as far as actually setting the policy for the HVAC admin, kind of like I said before, because of the uniqueness of that, we can only have ACLs that have permit or deny. I set 2 DAP policies here for our HVAC admin person here. One is a permit policy and one is a deny policy. So I went in here, and much like before, I said, okay, I want to make sure this policy applies to someone in the HVAC admin group. I set the action to continue because we want them allow them on. Now what I did was I put an ACL in here for basically a how to get to their HVAC system. And to do that, what you do is you click this manage button here, and basically it just brings up the standard ASDM ACL editor. And in this case, basically I just put a single line permit here that says basically, hey, you can only get to 192.168.57.27, basically the HVAC server. I went ahead and added that. Once you've selected it over here, don't forget to click this add button so it actually shows up in this list over here. Now I did the same thing with the deny policy, in the sense that I made sure I added the group membership and whatnot here, and I went ahead and set the continue policy. And then as far as network ACL, the network ACL I put in here was an explicit deny, basically deny any. Now you'll notice that I set the ACL priorities here to reflect our priority in that we want that permit to happen first. Basically this is going to permit him to his HVAC server. If he's trying to go somewhere that's not in his HVAC server, then it hits this next policy that says, well, you don't get anywhere else. Now because, obviously these policies are a little complicated, they did build a test mechanism in this as well. You just click down here where it says test dynamic access policies. So what I'll do is I want to test the HVAC one because I want to see what his resultant ACL is going to be. So what I do is I say, okay, who do I want to test? I want to add someone with an LDAP attribute who is a member of, and I go in here and I get the AD group for my VPN HVAC admin. I say okay, and I say okay. And now I want to know, okay, so if he's a member of this group, what's his DAP policy going to look like? So I just click this test button here. And you'll notice that it basically what it does is it mocks a login, it queries the AD server, and then it looks through the DAP policies, and you can see it puts this nice little debug out that shows you, okay, here are your configured policies, and then it will actually show you, because of his group memberships, which DAP records are going to apply to him, and we see that we have the permit to his server and the deny to everything else. And then you can see here where it will put out the priorities and how the access lists are ordered. And then you'll notice that it shows us what his aggregated access list is here. We'll see basically he's got a permit IP to this host, and then he's denied to anywhere else. Like I said, those policies can be a little complicated to configure at first, but once you get in here and you actually start playing around with it, it starts to make some sense. So to wrap things up here, just to kind of cover things we've already gone over, proper design decisions when you're doing your firewall zoning and configuration can basically improve your remote access security. Basically, by taking things like those finance servers or other things where, or in the case of HVAC, like if you zone your HVAC system, at the PC interface to it or whatever, away from the rest of your network. So even if your remote access gets compromised to one system or the other, basically you can kind of control the damage. Use your secure VPN to your security advantage by not exposing your critical or unsecure applications directly on the firewall for remote access. Use your AD authentication for VPN if possible. Benefits of that include a single sign-on, more robust firewall, or more robust password policy, enforcement, better auditing, less support calls for managed firewalls, as far as tickets to IPS, and more efficiency in your VPN administration. Obviously, for gold standard security, at some point in your future, you might want to plan to implement some type of two-factor authentication in combination with AD authentication, because this really is the most effective way to defeat dictionary and brute force attacks. If Target had had that in place, they probably would not have been able to hack into that network. And then the last thing is, going forward with this, whether you've got ITS managed firewall and you want to set this up, or whether you're doing your own, if you need help with it, we're here to help you guys. You can call us or email us anytime. We can work with you, to get ITS configured for you, or we can even help you get yours configured, help debug it, that kind of thing. I have some additional references here just for folks who like to read up on this stuff. I put the link to the Cisco DAP policy reference and the configure and the managing DAP policy on ASA Firewall documentation from Cisco. The other thing is, here in the CNE team, Diane and I developed a document that essentially walks you step by step through configuring an Anyconnect VPN, and also configuring DAP policies and integrating it with AD in a nice handy little document that has both the command line stuff and screenshots of doing it in the ASDM, and that is going to be available in the archive documentation for this presentation. So now, if there are any questions, I guess we'll use the chat window here if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. Everyone's being really quiet. So I guess if there aren't any questions, we'll probably go ahead and end it here. Again, I encourage you, if you haven't looked at integrating some type of authentication server into your VPN policy, or into your VPN for remote access, I would actively encourage you to do that for security reasons. And again, obviously we're here to help, if you guys need any help with that. So I guess if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and conclude just a little bit early here. And like I said, you can look for those materials posted to the webinar website archive there here in the not too distant future. Thanks everybody for attending. Really appreciate it.